And remember that P plus Q equals 1.0 is not on your data booklet either. So the next piece, again, is a little bit of mathematics, but we're looking at graphing. So if you remember this from Bio 20, we're going to look at growth curves. This is pretty important right now, given that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And the growth curve of the virus is really, really important right now, right? We're talking about flattening the curve or slowing the exponential growth rate down. What we're trying to do is slow down the doubling rate of the virus. So that's what we're doing with social distancing, right? So we're looking at these growth curve models. So this is actually this material is actually, the material that you're learning in this unit is actually being applied directly to public health, to being able to understand exponential growth curves. So let's start with this. Just as a reminder from Bio 20, these are called life history strategies. So biotic potential, when you look at any population, is it's used with the exponent r, or the value r, the highest possible per capita growth rate for a population given unlimited resources and ideal living conditions. So one thing you need to understand is every organism tries to reproduce at its biotic potential, but the environment limits that, and those are called limiting factors. It's dependent on a bunch of things: the number of offspring per reproductive cycle, the number of offspring that survive long enough to reproduce, the age of reproductive maturity, the number of times an individual reproduces in a lifespan, and the individual's lifespan itself, right? So some organisms can reproduce every 6 weeks, like mice or rats. Some organisms can reproduce once every 2 to 5 years, like blue whales, right? So the biotic potential of those organisms are much, much different. But if you live a long time, like a blue whale potentially does, if they don't end up with plastics in their belly or poached, or anything like that, or killed from container shipping or anything like that, then they can potentially reproduce for a long time. They're a very long-lived organism. Humans are weird because we have a long lifespan, but we also reproduce at a pretty high rate too. So we're a bit weird when it comes to these types of things. So that's biotic potential. Anything that, so this is one thing. So we have two growth curves that I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you an S-curve growth pattern, and I'm going to show you a J-curve. So an animal that is growing close to its biotic potential, so its ideal amount of offspring that it can produce, is shown to exhibit J-curved growth patterns. So exponential growth. And this is what we're seeing with viruses right now worldwide, is we're seeing an exponential growth pattern. And we're trying to turn that growth pattern from a J-curve into an S-curve. I'm going to show you that here. Okay, so J-curve growth is exponential growth. So what you have is organisms over time, and with bacteria or viruses, the doubling time is hours, right? Bacteria can reproduce, in a matter of 2 or 3 hours if you're being infected with a bacterial infection. Virus is the same thing, which is why we're trying to do social distancing, right? Because it limits the amount of contact where viruses can replicate in vectors, which we are right now. Humans are vectors, as are other organisms. We're not the only one that's spreading corona. It came from bats, and they detected it in tigers in the Bronx Zoo as well this week. So that's J-curve, and why? Because it looks like a J, right? So what you've got here is a lag. So you're always going to have a lag with any exponential growth phase because the population numbers are just too low in order to double really quickly. But once you reach sort of a certain critical mass, then the population explodes. And a lot of this has to do with density, right? So if density increases to a great amount, then there's not as much there's not as much distance between organisms to be able to exchange DNA and genetic information and things like that. So that's your exponential phase. And that's what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do with this exponential phase is flatten that out and turn it into S-curve growth pattern. So we're trying to turn it into logistic growth. Okay, so this happens with bacteria, right? That's a J-curve growth on your nodes. So you have your exponential phase and then your lag phase. The other form of growth is logistic growth, where we have a rapid growth rate, and then the growth rate levels off, and then either comes into homeostasis with the environment, or the individual or the organism that's experiencing the logistic growth is eliminated. So a logistic growth pattern occurs when a population is at carrying capacity. So K is the theoretical maximum amount of individuals that a population can sustain, given the resources of that environment. So biotic potential is ideally what an organism wants to be able to produce, and the carrying capacity is what the environment will allow. So the growth starts small, then it increases exponentially, right? But as the population increases, then there's more and more competition for limited resources, because there's more organisms vying for those resources. And you end up with the population reaching equilibrium. In the case of the virus, we don't want equilibrium. We want it to go away. Right, so this is S-curve growth. I'm just going to draw it right next to the J-curve growth. Right, so that's what we kind of want to do, is flatten that curve, is find stable equilibrium with an environment where we have basically herd immunity in the in our human population. So this is time, and these are organisms. Right, so it starts the same way. You have your lag, and then you have your exponential phase. Okay, and then you get what's called equilibrium, right? So you have the population reach equilibrium. So once we have organisms that have reached the maximum population number that an environment can handle, then the population doesn't change that much going forward. So think about big animals too, things like elephants, right? An environment can only sustain so many elephants, for example. And so in a lot of areas where poaching is a really, really big deal in Africa, they're using the argument of the fact that there's too many elephants in that area. In reality, there's not too many elephants in that area. There's not enough resources to be able to handle the current human population pressures with those elephants there. So if the human population pressures weren't there, then the environment could traditionally sustain more elephants. So the issue isn't the elephants, the issue is the humans. And we need to be able to deal with that, right? So that's part of the reason why we have, you still have trophy hunts in places like Botswana, because part of it is population control. Because they're wrecking farmers' crops and things like this. It's a very poor argument, but at the same time, the issue is not the elephant. The issue is the fact that there's way, way more humans there than what the environment was ever expected to sustain. So here's your equilibrium. So this is right, so this would happen with R selected if we look at the J curve. So these are R selected species, so they are selected to reproduce at biotic potential. They don't live a very long time either. Right, if I'm a population of mosquitoes, I live about 3 days and then I die. I can't live at my biotic potential for that long because you exhaust the resources of that environment. And then this is S-curve growth, where you have equilibrium. So this is typically K-selected species, where they're selected to live at the carrying capacity. So they are typically longer-lived organisms, larger body sizes and things like that. I'll expand on that later. So what happens here is that you have two things that make this equilibrium happen. You have the biotic potential of the organisms, And what the biotic potential is trying to do is push that amount of push the population numbers up as high as possible. And then what you have pushing that down is the environmental resistance. And the environmental resistance are all the limiting factors in an environment that will limit growth. And that could be predation, that could be parasitism, that could be nutrients, that could be water, that could be sunlight, that could be the spread of disease. It could be environmental change, like climate change. It could be habitat loss. So environmental resistance are all the things that limit growth in an environment. So this biotic potential of the organism and the limits the environment place on the organism to reproduce is what creates the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is a compromise between the two. And when we're able to measure carrying capacity, this is what drives conservation policy. So this is why we need to quantify populations. And this is why we need to do things like quantify evolutionary change, right? So, you can actually look at gene pool change with Hardy-Weinberg. So not only is evolution a thing, it's also something that's mathematically quantifiable. And if we don't understand these basic tenets, then there's no way that we can do good conservation. So, so things like looking at the carrying capacity and the reproductive history of different organisms, if good conservation policy is applied, then we're applying these types of mathematical realities to, things like how many hunting tags we give out each year to hunt moose or hunt deer or Rocky Mountain sheep in Alberta, and hopefully worldwide. But obviously, there's different ideologies and stakeholders and other individuals that would rather have an agenda pushed instead of understanding good science, right? So that's an important thing to take into consideration when you're looking at your poaching assignment too. Is just the sheer denial of logic that allows a lot of these things to still happen. All right, so that's your S curve, and that's your J curve. Right, so this is in your notes as well. So your logistic growth timeline here. Okay. So this is connected to things that, right, so limiting factors are all the things that limit growth in an environment. And all of those things combined gives you your environmental resistance. So your limiting factors are defined by two things. Ones that are dependent on population density and ones that are not dependent on population density. So these are things that will limit growth in a population because of the population numbers themselves or independent of the population density. So density dependent factors are things like disease transmission, right? So this is why we're doing social distancing right now, is to limit the amount of interaction that the population has, right? So you can see this. These are migrant workers on a train coming from Bangladesh to India. Bangladesh has the highest population density in the world. Something like 27,000 people per square kilometer. Right? So density-dependent factors don't limit growth when the population is small, but their impacts increase with increasing population. So disease, parasitism, predation, competition for resources becomes a bigger deal, and resource scarcity just in general becomes a greater effect, right? Now, I would argue that things that we see in the environment today could also be density dependent. If you look at, right, but in general, when you look at density independent factors, they are factors that limit growth in an environment, and they're not based on population. So they're not based on the biotic members of the community. So predation, parasitism, competition, those things don't matter. These things limit growth regardless of that. So extreme weather events, seasonal change happens regardless of how many organisms are in an environment. droughts, floods, and other natural disasters, those all will limit population growth regardless of the amount of organisms in a population. But I would argue that climate change is density independent and density dependent. It's because of the population density of the human population that is confounding a lot of these abiotic density independent factors, right? So the fact that there's 8.5 billion people on Earth burning fossil fuels makes these density independent factors more likely to be extreme. So I would say that density independent factors that limit growth can be connected to the population in and of itself, just not directly. Okay, right? If we only had 1 billion people on Earth burning fossil fuels, that would mean that we would have less extreme drought, less extreme flood, because that would be contributing to the greenhouse effect in a much smaller amount, right? So all of those limiting factors combined is the environmental resistance, right? So you guys have seen this from Bio 20. This is a little bit of an addition from Bio 20, but it's mostly just straight review. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to talk about is when we look at all these things combined, how does an organism evolve to live its life? So there's two big things that determine how an organism chooses to reproduce. And those two big things are actually body size and lifespan. And think about it, that they're connected, right? If you have a large body size, you have to live a longer time to be able to reach that body size. Humans are a very large-bodied organism when you think about all the biodiversity on Earth. Most of the biodiversity on Earth is microscopic, right? There's very few organisms that you can actually see outside of a microscope because microorganisms run the world. Right, so our selected species are small and they're selected for reproduction. They don't live a long time, so they try to reproduce as close to their biotic potential for a limited amount of time. Whereas K-selected species, they live at a carrying capacity. They live a long time, they don't reproduce as much, but they find stable equilibrium. Right, so the blue whale is the largest organism ever on Earth. That includes dinosaurs. So our selected species, right? So here's a couple of facts about our selected species. Again, short lifespan, small body size. There's no parental care. Most of the brood's going to die, right? If you think about insect eggs or fish eggs or things like that, they breed when conditions are good. Right? Think about seasonal insects, for example. Large fluctuations in population numbers, right? So there are no insects in the winter, right? And they all exist in larval stages, basically, in our water bodies in the winter, and then they explode in the summer. K-selected animals, they exist close to the carrying capacity. So they have a low biotic potential because they don't produce a lot of offspring in a single breeding cycle. But they have large body size, a long lifespan. And because they produce less offspring, they invest generally more in them. So there's parental care, right? Think about hopefully what your parents do for you. They invest a lot, maybe too much, right? Adolescence is a really weird thing in the animal kingdom, right? So it really doesn't happen other than in humans and in other primates, and we have a very extreme version of adolescence. Most animals can't afford that type of sort of limbo between childhood to adulthood. It takes a long time for human brains to develop, and that's why it exists. But if you think about an animal like a cheetah, right, it couldn't afford to be, an adolescent for a period of time, much longer than a few years. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to hunt and catch prey, things like that, right? So, delayed sexual maturation is something that generally happens in K-selected species, but it's very, very extreme in the human population. So that's kind of the cost of us having really large brains and a lot of convolutions, is that it takes a really long time to develop. So that's why we have this sort of weird stage that we call adolescence that you're all in the throes of right now. Anyway, mammals, birds, humans have very high fertility rates for a body size, but also live a long time. So there's a combination of these life history strategies that do exist, not with every organism, but at least in our case, absolutely for sure. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about today. I'll finish up these ecological interactions. this lecture series likely tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can page me. You should be able to use this information to help you with your poaching assignment. And I'll post this on YouTube once I've moved it over onto my hard drive. All right, bye now.